Step into the shadows with me, where forbidden knowledge awaits. This is the lore they never wanted you to know.
I don't remember my mother's face anymore, though I try sometimes in the moments before sleep comes, those brief minutes when exhaustion hasn't yet pulled me under, and consciousness still clings with desperate fingers to something that might resemble thought. What I remember instead is the smell of her synthy cloth worn too many days without washing, the acidic tang of cheap recaf on her breath, and underneath it all, that particular scent of human desperation that permeates the underhive like incense in a cathedral. She died when I was 7 standard years, crushed under a collapsed section of hab block ceiling in level -73. And I remember standing there, looking at her hand protruding from the rubble, still wearing the corroded ring my father had given her before he disappeared into the factorum and never came back. I stood there for perhaps 10 minutes before someone dragged me away, explaining with the casual cruelty of underhive pragmatism that there was nothing to be done, that the administratum wouldn't send recovery teams this deep, that the corpse would be gone within hours once the rats found it. That was 28 years ago, or near enough. Time is difficult to track in the underhive where the sun never reaches, and the only markers are the shift changes echoing down from the manufactorums above, and the periodic darkness when the power grid fails, and you sit in blackness so complete it feels like being buried alive. I survived my mother's death the way children in the underhive survive everything. By becoming feral, by learning that sentiment is a luxury that will kill you faster than the toxic air or the tainted water or the 1,000 other hazards that make every day a negotiation with mortality. I became a scavenger, one of the thousands who pick through the underhive's endless detritus, searching for anything that might be traded for food or water, or the chemical cocktails that pass for medicine in places where the Imperium's infrastructure has decayed into legend. The underhive of Tertius Majoris is a vast archaeological layer cake of human habitation, each level built upon the ruins of previous settlements, compression and decay, creating strata like sedimentary rock, except composed of corroded metal and crumbling ferrocrete, and the compressed remains of people who died and were built over rather than properly interred. I operate primarily in the levels between -90 and -120, deep enough that the enforcers from the upper hive never venture down, shallow enough that you're not in the absolute depths where things live that used to be human, and perhaps still are in some technical genetic sense, but have adapted to the darkness in ways that make them something else entirely. My territory, insofar as any scavenger can claim territory in the underhive's anarchic economy, encompasses perhaps 3 square kilometers of collapsed tunnels, abandoned hab blocks, and the skeletal remains of industrial facilities that failed centuries ago and were simply left to rust. The work is dangerous in ways that the hivers above could never comprehend, dangers that go beyond the obvious threats of unstable structures and toxic environments. Every collapsed tunnel might contain valuables worth trading, but it might also contain gang lookouts who'll kill you for trespassing, or nests of the mutant vermin that breed in the darkness and swarm over anything that moves, or pockets of gas that will ignite from your glow lamp and immolate you in seconds. I've lost count of how many scavengers I've known who simply disappeared, their absence noted only by the redistribution of their salvage routes among the survivors. The underhive doesn't waste time on mourning or memorials. You're here and then you're not, and the vast indifferent mechanism of the hive grinds on without pause. My kit consists of tools accumulated over decades of salvage, a pry bar made from a sharpened length of rebar, a hammer whose head is a chunk of compacted metal I've never been able to identify, a sack woven from synthy cloth strips that can hold perhaps 20 kilos before the seams start tearing, a filtration mask that removes some of the toxic particulates from the air though it does nothing about the smell, and a glow lamp, powered by a cell I recharge at one of the few functioning power outlets in my section. I wear layers of clothing scavenged from corpses and abandoned hab units, everything patched and repatched until the original garments are unidentifiable, wrapped in strips of rubberized material that provide some protection against the acids and caustics that leak from ancient pipes and pool in the low areas where the drainage systems failed generations ago. Food in the underhive comes from sources I learned early not to examine too closely. There are fungus farms in the deeper levels where mutants cultivate growths in human waste and chemical runoff, producing matter that is technically edible if you have the stomach enzymes to process it. There are protein bars distributed by the administratum that make their way down through various black market channels, usually years past their expiration dates, and harder than ferrocrete but containing enough nutrition to sustain life, if not exactly health. There are the corpse traders who operate in the darkest levels, and while everyone claims they would never stoop to that particular transaction, the reality is that protein is protein, and morality is a luxury for people who have the option of regular meals. I won't say I've never eaten meat whose provenance I didn't question. I won't say I'm proud of it. I will say I'm alive, which in the underhive counts for more than pride. Water is perhaps the greatest challenge, more precious than food because you can survive weeks without eating but only days without hydration. The pipes that run through the underhive carry runoff from the levels above, industrial waste and sewage and chemical effluent, all mixed together in streams that will kill you if you drink them untreated. I have a filtration rig cobbled together from salvaged components, a series of containers where I let the water settle and separate, running it through charcoal and sand, and finally through a purification tablet I obtain from a trader who operates out of a fortified position in level -85. Even filtered, the water tastes of metal and chemicals and despair, but it won't immediately poison you, which represents the height of quality in underhive commodities. I share a hab space with 4 other scavengers in a section of collapsed tunnel we've reinforced with scrap metal and sealed with polymer foam scavenged from a construction site. The space is perhaps 4 meters by 3 meters, barely tall enough to stand in the center where we've propped the ceiling with metal supports, tapering to crawl height at the edges. We each have a sleeping space marked by territorial instinct rather than any formal agreement, places where we pile our few possessions and curl up during the rest periods when exhaustion demands temporary cessation of the constant struggle for survival. There's Keller, a man perhaps 50 years old though he looks 70, missing his left arm below the elbow from an encounter with machinery he refuses to discuss. There's Yana, a woman whose face is covered in burn scars from a chemical fire, who rarely speaks but moves through the underhive with a grace that suggests she wasn't always a scavenger. There's Twisted Jacob, named for the way his spine curves from some childhood disease that was never treated, who can squeeze into spaces none of the rest of us can access and regularly returns with salvage that shouldn't have been retrievable. And there's Moth, a boy perhaps 13 years old, so named because he's drawn to light sources with an intensity that borders on compulsion, who we took in after finding him eating rats in a collapsed hab block, and who follows me on salvage runs like a feral dog that's decided you might be worth trusting. Our days, though days is a meaningless concept in the eternal twilight of the underhive, follow patterns dictated by survival necessity. We wake when our bodies demand it, eat whatever food we've managed to acquire, and set out on salvage runs through our respective territories. The underhive produces an endless supply of salvageable material as the levels above discard their waste, as structures collapse and expose new areas, as people die and leave their possessions to be claimed by whoever finds them first. Metal is valuable, especially copper and the various alloys used in Imperial technology. Plastic components, synthi-cloth, chemcells, wire, tubing, anything that can be repurposed or traded to the merchants who operate in the border zones between the underhive and the lower levels of proper hive civilization. And sometimes, rarely, you find items of real value, functioning tools, weapons, or most precious of all, Imperial documentation that can be sold to forgers who produce false identities for those desperate enough to try escaping the underhive into the levels above. The trade network in the underhive is complex and violent, a web of relationships mediated by the gangs who control key territories and exact tribute from anyone moving goods through their areas. The largest gang in our section is called the Rust Kings, operating out of a fortified complex in level -98, controlling the primary route between the salvage zones and the merchant areas where goods can be traded for food and supplies. Their leader is a man known only as Crown, whose face I've never seen but whose reputation is sufficient to ensure compliance with the tribute demands. 20% of whatever you're carrying, assessed by gang members who've developed a sophisticated understanding of salvage value, and in exchange you pass through their territory unmolested and under their nominal protection against freelance raiders. I encountered the Rust Kings directly in my 10th year of scavenging, before I understood the rules and tried to move salvage through a collapsed tunnel that bypassed their checkpoint. They caught me emerging from the tunnel with a sack of copper wire, 3 gang members materializing from the shadows, with weapons ranging from sharpened rebar to an actual autogun that looked ancient but functional. They didn't kill me, though I thought they would in those first terrible seconds when violence seemed inevitable. Instead, they beat me, methodically and without particular cruelty, just enough to ensure the lesson stuck, and then they took my entire salvage load plus my pry bar and explained in terms a child could understand that the tribute wasn't optional, and attempting to bypass it would result in outcomes significantly worse than a beating. I paid my tribute after that, 20% assessed honestly because trying to cheat would have been suicide, and in exchange I operated under their protection for the next 18 years. The protection proved its worth periodically when freelance raiders or rival gang scouts tested the borders of Rust King territory. The Underhive breeds violence like standing water breeds disease, spontaneous and inevitable, and the only defense is affiliation with forces capable of projecting power across the anarchic territories. I saw a scavenger named Dross who refused to pay tribute, claiming he was independent and owed nothing to anyone. The Rust Kings hung his body from a pipe outcrop where 3 territories met, display and warning both, and left it there until the rats and the environment reduced it to bones, which took perhaps 6 weeks in the Underhive's accelerated decay cycle. The message was clear, and I never forgot it. Independence is death. Isolation is death. Attempting to exist outside the power structures is death, and survival requires submission to systems whose cruelty is at least predictable. Moth joined me on a salvage run in the remains of what had been a medical facility, or so the corroded sign suggested, in level -105. The structure had collapsed decades ago based on the rust patterns and structural decay, creating a maze of tilted corridors and rooms accessible only by crawling through gaps in the rubble. Medical facilities are valuable salvage sites because they contain instruments made from quality metals and occasionally storage caches of pharmaceuticals that haven't fully degraded. We squeezed through a gap barely wide enough for my shoulders, Moth slipping through easily with his smaller frame into a room that had been sealed by the collapse and thus preserved from the Underhive's usual scavenger attention. The bodies were still there, medical staff and patients both, mummified by the dry air that had been trapped when the collapse sealed the room. They sat or lay in positions that suggested the collapse had come without warning, doctors frozen in the middle of procedures, patients on tables with their conditions forever untreated. The bodies had degraded to leather and bone, clothing reduced to discolored rags, but they retained enough form to be recognizable as human, as people who had once lived and worked and died, thinking perhaps that help would come, that they'd be rescued, that someone would care enough to dig them out. No one had. The Imperium doesn't waste resources recovering corpses from the Underhive, doesn't send rescue teams for the thousands who die in collapses and fires and the casual violence of abandoned populations. These people had suffocated or died of thirst while waiting for salvation that never came and never would. Moth stared at the bodies with an expression I couldn't read in the glow lamp's uncertain light, his face a mask of shadows and highlights that made him look older than his years. I wondered if he was thinking about his own mortality, about the high probability that he'd end up like these corpses, unrecovered and unmourned, just another addition to the Underhive's vast necropolis. But then he moved to the nearest body and began efficiently stripping it of anything valuable, a metal necklace, the buckles from its boots, a ring that required breaking the finger to remove, and I understood that he was thinking nothing of the sort, that he'd already internalized the lesson that sentiment is a luxury and the dead have no use for the materials they're wearing. I helped him search the room, trying not to look too closely at the faces, trying not to imagine their final hours, trying not to acknowledge that the only difference between them and me was timing and a bare margin of luck. We found pharmaceuticals in a sealed storage unit, bottles with labels too faded to read, but contents that seemed intact based on weight and the lack of obvious degradation. Pharmaceuticals could be traded for significant food supplies if we could get them to a merchant who knew how to assess their value. We also found surgical instruments, scalpels and clamps and tools whose purposes I couldn't identify, all made from quality steel that would be valuable even if melted down for raw material. The haul was substantial, perhaps the best single salvage I'd made in months, and I remember feeling something like satisfaction as we loaded everything into my sack and Moth's smaller bag. Satisfaction lasted approximately 20 minutes, until we squeezed back through the gap into the corridor and found 3 figures waiting for us in the darkness. They weren't Rust Kings, which I knew immediately from the way they stood and the visible weapons they carried. Rust Kings project authority through organization and uniform markers, scraps of red cloth tied around their arms, specific patterns of face paint, a cohesion that comes from being part of an actual power structure. These were freelancers, raiders who operated in the gaps between gang territories, surviving by preying on scavengers who couldn't or wouldn't pay for protection. 2 of them had clubs made from metal pipes. The third had what looked like a flare gun, probably non-functional but convincing enough in the dark. They blocked the corridor between us and the route back to Rust King territory, and their leader, a woman whose face was hidden behind a filtration mask, made a gesture that was universally understood. Drop your salvage and back away slowly. I've survived 28 years in the Underhive by knowing when to fight and when to submit, and this was clearly a submission situation. 3 against 2, we were outnumbered. They were armed better than us. We were loaded with salvage that made us slow. Fighting would mean injury or death with low probability of victory. I started to lower my sack, preparing to lose the day's salvage rather than lose my life, accepting the bitter arithmetic of Underhive survival. But Moth didn't lower his bag. Moth pulled out one of the surgical scalpels we'd just salvaged and moved toward the raiders with a speed that shocked me, a feral swiftness that belonged to the mutant vermin rather than a 13-year-old boy. What happened next lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but unfolded with the terrible clarity that violence sometimes achieves, every moment distinct and frozen. Moth ducked under the swing of the first raider's club and drove the scalpel into the man's thigh, a precise strike that severed something important based on the way blood sprayed in a pulsing arc. The second raider swung at Moth but hit the first raider instead as Moth twisted away, the club connecting with a sound like breaking sticks. The woman with the flare gun pointed it at Moth and pulled the trigger, and nothing happened. I'd been right about it being non-functional, and then Moth was on her with the scalpel, moving with an efficiency that suggested this wasn't his first time using edged weapons on human targets. I stood there holding my sack while a 13-year-old boy killed 3 adult raiders in the time it took me to process that violence had occurred. When it was over, Moth stood breathing hard, covered in blood that looked black in the glow lamp light, holding the scalpel in a grip that had left his knuckles white. The raiders were down, one clearly dead, the other 2 making sounds that suggested they wouldn't last long without medical attention they'd never receive. Moth turned to look at me, his eyes catching the light in a way that made them glow like an animal's, and I saw something in that gaze that made me understand he'd never been a child. Not really. That whatever innocence humanity is supposed to possess had been burned out of him long before I found him eating rats. We looted the raiders' bodies, practical necessity rather than cruelty, though I'm not sure there's a meaningful difference in the Underhive, and continued back to Rust King territory with our salvage and the raiders' equipment both. I said nothing about what had happened. Moth said nothing either. We carried our loads in silence through corridors that echoed with distant machinery and dripping water, and occasionally the screams of people dying in the darkness. The Underhive absorbs violence like earth absorbs rain, another incident in an endless catalogue of incidents, meaningless in aggregate. The pharmaceuticals traded well, though the merchant who assessed them took a substantial cut for himself, and the Rust Kings took their 20% tribute, leaving us with enough credits to purchase food for a week and new filtration masks to replace the ones whose seals had degraded. I gave Moth his share, and he took it without comment, disappearing into the hab space's shadows to count it privately and probably hide it somewhere only he knew about. Trust in the Underhive extends only as far as immediate necessity, and sleeping near people doesn't make them trustworthy, only available to betray you. The raids started perhaps a month after the pharmaceutical salvage, though time is uncertain and I might be misremembering the sequence. Raiders began operating with increased frequency in the salvage zones, not freelancers but organized groups that moved with tactical precision and carried better weapons than the usual Underhive improvisation. They attacked scavengers returning from salvage runs, taking loads before they could be delivered to merchants, killing anyone who resisted, and occasionally killing people who didn't resist just to ensure compliance from others. The Rust Kings tried to respond, increasing patrols and offering escort services for premium tribute, but the raids continued and escalated until it became clear that we were dealing with something beyond normal gang competition. The truth emerged gradually through rumor and observation, and the testimony of those who survived encounters and managed to reach safety. The raiders weren't a new gang emerging from the Underhive's usual territorial competition. They were recruiters for something worse, something that operated in the deepest levels where even gangs feared to establish territory, places where the Imperium's light had never reached, and humanity had adapted or degraded into forms that made gang violence seem wholesome by comparison. They called themselves the Broken, or so the survivors reported, and they were taking people, not salvage, taking them alive, dragging them down into the depths, for purposes nobody wanted to speculate about but everyone understood were not conducive to continued existence in any form worth maintaining. I encountered the Broken directly during a salvage run in level -115, deeper than I usually operated but promising access to an industrial complex that had collapsed only recently and thus hadn't been fully stripped by other scavengers. Moth was with me, as he often was, moving through the darkness with that unnatural grace that made me wonder sometimes what exactly he was, whether he was entirely human or something that had learned to pass for human well enough to be accepted by those who didn't look too closely. We were extracting copper wire from a control panel when we heard the sounds, not the usual Underhive sounds of dripping and machinery and rats, but something else, something that might have been chanting or might have been machinery tuned to frequencies that approximated human voices. We should have left immediately. Every instinct screamed at me to abandon the salvage and retreat to safer levels, but Moth moved toward the sound with that same drawn-to-light compulsion that had given him his name, and I followed because leaving him would have been a different kind of death, the slow death of isolation and self-betrayal that the Underhive inflicts on those who abandon the few connections they manage to form. We moved through collapsed corridors toward the source of the sound, and eventually we found them. The chamber had been a water treatment facility based on the massive tanks and pipe networks, now drained and repurposed into something else entirely. The Broken were there, perhaps 24 of them, and broken was an apt description because they'd been systematically modified in ways that went beyond the crude augmentation common in the Underhive. They'd had limbs removed and replaced with mechanical components that looked more like industrial equipment than prosthetics. They'd had faces altered, features removed or rearranged, eyes replaced with optical sensors or simply sealed over with metal plates. They'd been made into something between human and machine and servitor, but without the lobotomization that makes servitors merciful, retaining awareness and perhaps even agency, but existing in states that made death seem preferable to continued function. In the center of the chamber was a structure that might have been an altar or might have been a surgical table, hard to distinguish in the uncertain light from our glow lamps. On the structure was a person I couldn't tell gender or age from the distance, just a human form strapped down and surrounded by the Broken who were doing things with tools and components I couldn't fully see but could hear. The wet sounds of cutting and the mechanical sounds of assembly, and above it all the screaming that might have been the victim or might have been the Broken themselves, transformed into creatures that screamed continuously whether they wanted to or not. Moth pulled at my arm, finally showing fear, finally recognizing a danger that exceeded even his feral capacity for violence. We retreated through the corridors, moving as silently as possible, trying not to run because running makes noise and noise attracts attention. Behind us the sounds continued, that terrible amalgamation of chanting and machinery and screaming, echoing through the collapsed sections with an acoustic quality that made it seem to come from everywhere at once. We didn't stop until we'd climbed 3 levels and put multiple sealed sections between us and that chamber, and even then I could still hear it, whether from actual sound transmission through the metal or from memory imprinting itself directly onto my consciousness. We told no one about what we'd seen, partly from fear, partly from the knowledge that there was nothing to be done, partly from the understanding that in the Underhive you survived by maintaining careful ignorance of certain things, by not asking questions whose answers would require responses you couldn't afford. The Broken continued their raids, continued taking people, and we continued trying to avoid them, shifting our salvage routes away from the deeper levels, accepting reduced yields rather than increased danger. But the Underhive is a finite space, at least the sections survivable by unmodified humans, and as the Broken expanded their operating territory, the space available for normal scavenging contracted. The gangs responded with unprecedented cooperation, the Rust Kings and their rivals forming temporary alliances to combat the common threat, sending war parties into the depths to confront the Broken directly. Some of these parties returned, diminished and traumatized, reporting battles in darkness against enemies that moved with inhuman precision and seemed to feel no pain even when dismembered. Other parties didn't return at all, disappearing into the depths, their fates unknown but speculated upon with a dread that was worse than certainty. The Rust Kings initiated mandatory conscription, pulling scavengers from their territories to supplement the war parties, requiring service in exchange for continued protection and trading rights. I was conscripted along with Moth and Yana. Given crude weapons, I received a length of pipe with one end sharpened to a point. Moth got a knife with a blade that looked like it had been snapped off something larger. Yana got nothing, but was told to pick up whatever weapons fell during the fighting. We were incorporated into a war party 20 strong, led by a Rust King enforcer who introduced himself as Scratch and made it clear that retreat without orders would be punished more severely than anything the Broken could do to us. We descended into level -123, deeper than I'd ever operated, into sections where the air was thick enough to see, where bioluminescent fungus provided the only light source, where the walls wept moisture that might have been water or might have been something else. The architecture in these depths was older, the construction methods suggesting these sections had been built before current Imperial standards, perhaps dating back to the original planetary colonization. We moved through corridors whose walls were covered in symbols I couldn't read, prayers or warnings, or simple graffiti accumulated over millennia, passing collapsed sections and sealed bulkheads and occasional spaces where people had tried to establish habitation before giving up or dying or being absorbed into the darkness. The attack came without warning in a chamber junction where 4 corridors met. The Broken dropped from above, emerging from gaps in the ceiling we hadn't thought to watch, falling among us with weapons that hummed and sparked. The war party disintegrated into individual struggles, order collapsing into chaos within seconds. I swung my sharpened pipe at a figure that might once have been a woman but now sported 3 arms and a face that was more metal than flesh. Connected but felt the impact jar my bones, did no visible damage, and then something hit me from behind, and I was on the ground with pressure on my back and cold metal touching my neck. I don't remember clearly what happened next. The sequence fragmented by trauma and fear and possibly head injury from the fall. I remember being dragged, my legs scraping against rough ferrocrete, my hands secured behind my back with something that felt like wire cutting into my wrists. I remember passing through corridors that grew progressively stranger, walls that seemed organic rather than constructed, surfaces that moved in ways solid matter shouldn't move. I remember screaming, though whether it was my screaming or someone else's, or the eternal screaming of the Broken themselves, I couldn't determine. And I remember the smell, overwhelming everything else. A mixture of rot and chemicals and burnt meat and something sweet that made my gorge rise and my mind try to shut down rather than process the sensory input. I woke strapped to a table in a chamber lit by work lights that had been positioned to illuminate a specific area, leaving the surrounding space in shadow. My vision was blurred but slowly clearing, enough to see that I wasn't alone. Other captives were present, strapped to similar tables arranged in rows, maybe a dozen total that I could see. Some were conscious and struggling against their restraints, some were unconscious or dead, some were in states between consciousness and unconsciousness where they twitched and made sounds that suggested awareness without coherent thought. The Broken moved among the tables, working with tools and components, occasionally stopping to examine a captive with interest that was clinical rather than cruel, the detachment of engineers assessing raw materials. One of the Broken approached my table, a figure whose original gender was impossible to determine, sporting augmentations that included an extra set of arms emerging from its back and a face that had been almost entirely replaced with optical sensors and vocalization equipment. It looked down at me with whatever passed for its vision, sensors clicking and whirring, and then it spoke in a voice that was synthesized but retained enough human inflection to be comprehensible. "You are suitable," it said, which was somehow worse than any threat could have been, because being suitable meant I met criteria for whatever transformation they had planned, meant I'd been selected for conversion rather than disposal. The figure moved away, and I heard it discussing something with another of the broken, their conversation a mixture of Gothic and binary cant, and occasionally sounds that weren't language at all but data exchange between augmetic components. I struggled against my restraints with desperate strength, managing only to cut my wrists deeper on the wire, achieving nothing except exhausting myself further. Around me, other captives struggled or had given up struggling, and I wondered which approach was correct, whether fighting increased or decreased your chances of survival, or whether survival in any meaningful sense was already impossible and we were simply choosing between different forms of cessation. Moth saved me, though I didn't realize it was him initially, because he'd covered himself in blood and offal and moved among the broken with a mimicry of their movements that was convincing enough to pass casual inspection in the uncertain light. He appeared next to my table holding a knife, the same knife he'd been issued, or perhaps one taken from a fallen enemy, hard to tell, and cut my restraints with efficient motions that showed no hesitation or doubt. He gestured for silence, indicating I should follow, and we moved between the tables toward a corridor opening while the broken were occupied with their work, two figures among many in a chamber where movement was constant and attention was focused on specific tasks rather than general surveillance. We passed perhaps 3 other captives who were conscious enough to register our escape, their eyes following us with expressions ranging from hope to envy to something like accusation, as if by saving ourselves we were betraying them to whatever fate awaited. I wanted to stop, wanted to free them, wanted to do something other than abandon them the way I'd been taught to abandon everyone who couldn't keep up or provide utility. But Moth pulled at my arm with urgent strength, and I understood that stopping meant discovery meant death or worse, and I followed him through the corridor and up through levels where the architecture gradually became more familiar and less organic, climbing toward the relatively safe territories where the Rust Kings maintained their power. We emerged into level -108 3 days after the raid, or so I was told later because I'd lost all sense of time in those depths. Of the 20-strong war party that had descended, 5 returned, including Moth and myself. The others had been killed or captured, their fates unknown but easily imagined. The Rust Kings declared the expedition a victory because we'd confirmed the Broken's main operating base and survived to report its location, though victory seemed an ambitious description for 75% casualties and no strategic objectives achieved. I couldn't return to scavenging after that, not immediately, and perhaps not ever in the same way I'd operated before. Something had broken inside me during those hours strapped to that table, some capacity for hope or denial that had allowed me to believe survival was meaningful or possible long-term. I'd seen what waited in the depths, understood that the Underhive was more than simply a place of decay and violence, that it was actively malevolent in ways that went beyond human cruelty into territories where humanity itself became raw material for transformation into things that shouldn't exist. Moth seemed unchanged by the experience, resuming his normal patterns of salvage and survival, moving through the Underhive with the same feral efficiency. But I noticed he avoided the deeper levels now, operated exclusively in zones where the Rust Kings maintained patrols, and sometimes I'd see him staring into darkness with an expression that suggested he was remembering things he'd prefer to forget. We never discussed what happened in those depths. The Underhive breeds silence about certain things, understanding that speaking them aloud gives them power they don't need. I'm writing this not literally. I have neither materials nor privacy for actual writing, but composing it in my mind as a testament that someone should remember because the Underhive is collapsing, not metaphorically, though it's doing that too, but literally, physically coming apart as the ancient structures finally succumb to millennia of accumulated decay. Sections are falling daily now, entire levels dropping into the depths, the sounds of metal tearing and ferrocrete shattering providing constant background noise. The Administratum claims they're conducting controlled demolition to eliminate the Underhive entirely, to collapse the levels and seal them and build something new on top, though whether that's true or simply their explanation for failure of infrastructure they never maintained is unclear. The gangs are evacuating upward, fighting for territory in the lower Hive levels, trying to force their way into areas that have been closed to Underhive residents for generations. Some are succeeding through violence or bribery or sheer desperate numbers. Others are being repelled by the enforcers who maintain the boundaries between the Hive proper and the Underhive, who've received orders to prevent the collapse from triggering an upward migration that would destabilize the established order. We scavengers are caught between the rising violence below and the sealed barriers above, trapped in a diminishing space as the underhive consumes itself. Moth disappeared 3 weeks ago, or what I think was 3 weeks' time is even more fluid now with the constant movement and disruption. He went on a salvage run into a section that collapsed 6 hours later, or so the survivors reported, bringing down 3 levels and sealing the access points. I waited at our hab space for 2 days hoping he'd emerge from some alternate route, but he never returned. I tell myself he escaped somehow, found a way to the surface or the lower hive, that his feral cunning saw him through where others would have died. But I know the truth. The underhive took him the way it takes everything eventually, absorbed him into the vast necropolis of forgotten souls, added him to the compression layer that future scavengers might pick through centuries hence. I'm moving upward now, part of a refugee mass that numbers in the thousands, carrying what little I can in my salvage sack, hoping to find a way through the barriers before the final collapse. The broken are rising too, driven from their depths by the structural failure, coming up into territories where they can be seen clearly, and what I see confirms that what they're building in those depths is worse than I imagined. They're creating a society, if you can call it that, a civilization of the transformed and the broken, people who've been systematically converted into components of a larger machine whose purpose is impossible to comprehend with human logic. The enforcers are killing the broken when they encounter them, flamers and automatic weapons creating kill zones at the major access points, barriers of corpses that grow larger daily. But there are always more broken, ascending from depths we never fully explored, suggesting their population is larger than anyone suspected, that they've been growing in the darkness for decades or centuries, that the underhive contained an entire hidden world beneath the world we thought we knew, and mixed among the broken are the people they've captured and partially transformed, individuals who are still recognizably human but sporting the augmentations that mark them as belonging to something else, caught between 2 states and apparently unable or unwilling to complete their transformation. I saw Yana among them, or someone who might have been Yana, hard to confirm given the modifications. She was moving with a group of broken through a collapsed section, her arms replaced with mechanical components, her face partially covered with metal plating, but her eyes were still human, still aware, and when they met mine, they held an expression that might have been pleading, or might have been warning, or might have been simple recognition that we'd both ended up exactly where the underhive always intended us to end. I'm tired now, more tired than simple physical exhaustion can explain. Tired in ways that go down to the cellular level and make continued existence feel like a burden rather than an achievement. I've survived 28 years in the underhive, longer than my mother, longer than most. And what do I have to show for it except scars and trauma and the knowledge that survival is not the same as living, that continuing to exist is not meaningful in itself without purpose or hope or connection to something larger than mere biological persistence. The barriers are ahead, enforcer positions blocking the routes upward, and beyond them the lower hive levels where people live in poverty and oppression but at least live in light, see the sky even if only through pollution, exist in spaces where the Imperium maintains some nominal presence even if only to extract tithes and enforce compliance. I'm going to try to breach those barriers, knowing the probable outcome is death from enforcer weapons or rejection back into the collapsing underhive, because the alternative is waiting here for the structures to fail completely and drop me into the depths where the broken are waiting. I think about Moth sometimes, about the way he moved through darkness with such certainty, about his capacity for violence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond normal human rage or fear, about whether he was already partially what the broken were trying to create, a transitional form between human and something else. I think about my mother buried under rubble in level -73, never recovered, her body contributing to the compression layer that makes up the underhive's foundation. I think about all the people I've known who disappeared into the darkness, who died in collapses or raids, or simply gave up and stopped moving, and I wonder if any of this has meant anything, if survival for survival's sake is a goal worth pursuing or just another delusion we maintain to avoid confronting the absolute meaninglessness of existence in the underhive. The enforcers are shouting now, ordering the refugee mass to disperse, to return to the underhive, warning that force will be used against anyone attempting to breach the barriers. Some people are complying, turning back toward the collapsing sections, choosing certain death over probable death, the calculation making sense in its own terrible way. Others are pushing forward, desperate or hopeless, or simply too tired to care about threats anymore. I'm among the latter, moving toward the barrier with my salvage sack and my tools and nothing else, hoping that somehow the enforcers will see that I'm human, that I deserve to live in the light, that 28 years of surviving the Underhive should count for something. The shooting has started, and people are falling around me, and I'm still moving forward because stopping means dying here, and dying here means everything I've endured was pointless, meant Moth died for nothing, meant my mother's sacrifice of her life to produce mine was wasted. I'm moving through the smoke and the screaming and the bodies, and I can see the barrier ahead, can see the enforcers with their weapons, can see beyond them the lower hive levels, where lights burn steady and air circulates, and people live lives that include something other than constant struggle against death. I'm at the barrier now, and an enforcer is pointing a weapon at me, and I'm raising my hands to show I'm unarmed, to show I'm not a threat, to show I'm human despite the filth and the scars and the years of degradation. He's looking at me with an expression that might be pity, or might be disgust, or might be simple indifference, the look of someone who's killed so many people that one more makes no difference. And I realize in this moment, with death so close I can smell the promethium in his flamer, that this is what the Underhive was always leading to, that survival was never the point, because the point was that there is no point, that we scavenge and struggle and die in darkness, while above us the Imperium grinds on without noticing or caring, that individual human lives mean nothing except as components in a vast machine that exists only to perpetuate itself. The enforcer is saying something. I can't hear over the noise, and his finger is tightening on the trigger, and I'm thinking about Moth moving through darkness, about my mother's hand protruding from rubble, about all the people I've known who are gone now, consumed by the Underhive's hunger, and I understand finally that I was always going to end here, that there was never any escape, that the Underhive takes everyone eventually, and the only variable is how long you manage to delay the inevitable. The flames are coming now, and they're hot, hotter than the chemical fires or the plasma leaks, hot enough to burn away everything flesh and memory and fear, and all the accumulated weight of years spent surviving for no reason except the biological imperative to continue, and in this final moment I feel something that might be relief, because at least the struggle is ending. At least I don't have to keep fighting against the certain knowledge that nothing I've done has mattered, and nothing anyone does in the Underhive will ever matter. This is what it means to be a scavenger in the Underhive of the 41st millennium. This is what it means to live in the darkness beneath the Imperium's light, to survive in spaces where humanity has been forgotten by the very empire that claims to protect it, to exist as something less than human because to the powers above you were never fully human to begin with, just raw material to be used and discarded, just another component in the vast machine that grinds on forever. Indifferent to suffering, indifferent to death, indifferent to everything except its own eternal continuation. The flames take me, and I'm grateful.